The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Whitmore mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floor where broken glass sparkled like diamonds. Margaret Whitmore sat in her wheelchair, staring at the mess she had created just minutes before. The crystal vase had been a wedding gift from 40 years ago, but now it lay shattered against the wall, just like everything else in her life. Her latest caregiver, a young woman named Jennifer, had already packed her bags and called for a taxi. She was the 7th one this year, and it was only August. They all started the same way, full of hope and professional smiles, talking about how they could help Margaret regain some independence. They all ended the same way too, running out the front door with tears in their eyes and harsh words on their lips. Margaret rolled her wheelchair closer to the French doors that led to her private terrace. Through the glass, she could see her son David pacing back and forth in the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was muffled, but she could tell he was angry. He always got that crease between his eyebrows when he was frustrated, the same expression his father used to have during business meetings. Her daughter Patricia sat on the cream-colored sofa, typing furiously on her laptop. She barely looked up when David raised his voice, too busy with her own important life to deal with her mother's problems. Both of her children had families of their own now, careers that demanded their attention, lives that moved forward while Margaret remained stuck in the same spot she had been for 20 long years. The accident had happened on a crisp October morning in 2004. Margaret had been an accomplished equestrian, winning ribbons at local competitions and teaching riding lessons to children from wealthy families. Thunder, her favorite horse, had been spooked by a car backfiring on the country road that ran along the riding trail. One moment she was cantering through fallen leaves, feeling alive and free, and the next she was lying on the ground, unable to feel anything below her waist. The doctors had been kind but honest. The damage to her spinal cord was severe. There might be some sensation that returned over time, they said, but the chances of walking again were practically zero. Margaret had been 45 then, still young enough to believe in miracles. She had thrown herself into physical therapy with the same determination she brought to everything else in her life. For 3 years, she pushed her body to its limits, convinced that willpower alone could heal what medicine could not fix. But willpower, she discovered, had its limits. The miracle never came. The sensation never returned. Slowly, the hope that had kept her going began to fade, replaced by something much darker. Anger became her constant companion, bitterness her closest friend. The woman who had once organized charity galas and hosted dinner parties for 30 people became someone even her own family struggled to recognize. The mansion that had once been filled with laughter and guests now felt like a prison. The grand staircase she could no longer climb mocked her every day. The tennis court where she had played doubles with friends grew weeds through the cracks. The swimming pool sat empty, too painful a reminder of the rehabilitation sessions that had promised so much and delivered so little. David ended his phone call and walked over to the French doors. He knocked gently before opening them, stepping onto the terrace where Margaret sat watching the gardeners trim the rose bushes. They moved efficiently, cutting away dead branches to make room for new growth. She envied them that simple purpose. "Mother, we need to talk," David said, pulling up one of the wicker chairs to sit beside her. He was 43 now, successful in his father's business, but he still had the nervous habit of adjusting his tie when he was uncomfortable. "Let me guess," Margaret said without looking at him. "Another caregiver has quit, and you're here to lecture me about my behavior." "Jennifer was a good person, Mom. She really wanted to help you." Margaret finally turned to face her son. "Help? Me what, David? Walk again, turn back time, pretend that my life isn't over? Your life isn't over. You just make it difficult for people to care about you." The words stung because they carried truth. Margaret had built walls around herself so high that even her own children couldn't climb them anymore, but those walls were the only thing protecting her from the pain that threatened to drown her every single day. Patricia joined them on the terrace, her laptop forgotten for the moment. She looked tired, Margaret noticed. There were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Mom, David and I have been talking. If you can't keep a caregiver for more than a few months, we might need to consider other options." "What kind of other options?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "There are some very nice facilities," Patricia said carefully. "Places where you could have proper care, social activities, People your own age to talk to. You mean a nursing home? A retirement community, David corrected. Some of them are really beautiful. They have programs, organized trips, professional staff who know how to deal with difficult people like me. The silence that followed was answer enough. Margaret looked out at the gardens that had been her pride and joy, at the fountain, where birds came to drink each morning, at the oak tree where her grandchildren had played when they were smaller. The thought of leaving all of this, of being warehoused with other broken people in a sterile building somewhere, made her chest tight with panic. I don't want strangers taking care of me, she said quietly. Then you need to stop driving away. Everyone who tries, Patricia replied. We've been through 7 caregivers this year, Mom. 7. The agency is starting to refuse our calls. Margaret knew her children were right, but admitting it felt like surrendering the last bit of control. She had left. For 20 years, her sharp tongue and impossible demands had been her only weapons against a world that seemed determined to treat her like a helpless child. If she gave that up, what would she have left? There is one more option, David said, hesitantly. Mrs. Henderson at the country club mentioned an agency that specializes in difficult cases. They have caregivers who are more experienced with challenging situations. You mean they send people who can tolerate abuse? Margaret said bitterly. I mean they send people who understand that sometimes difficult behavior comes from pain, not meanness, Patricia said. Maybe someone like that could help you find a better way to deal with all of this. Margaret wanted to argue, to tell them that she didn't need fixing, that the world had broken her and she had every right to be angry about it. But the alternative was losing her home, losing the last connection she had to the life she used to live. The walls of her prison might be of her own making, but at least they were familiar walls. Fine, she said finally. One more try. But when this person quits too, and they will quit, I don't want to hear any more talk about facilities or retirement communities or any other polite words for places where people go to die. David reached over and squeezed her hand. It's going to be okay, Mom. Maybe this time will be different. Margaret doubted it. In her experience, hope was just disappointment waiting to happen. She had learned to expect the worst from people, and they rarely surprised her. But as she sat on her terrace, surrounded by the broken glass of her latest outburst and the worried faces of her children, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was tired of being disappointed. Maybe she was even tired of being disappointing. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming her face through the glass doors. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of children playing in a neighbor's yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze like a memory of better times. For just a moment, Margaret allowed herself to remember what it felt like to believe that good things were possible. Then she rolled her wheelchair back inside, leaving her children to clean up the mess she had made, just like always. But this time, something felt different. This time, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy, and the walls didn't seem quite so high. This time, she found herself wondering what kind of person would be brave enough or foolish enough to take on someone like her. She didn't have to wait long to find out. 3 days later, Margaret heard the doorbell ring at exactly 9 a.m. She had been expecting this moment, dreading it really, ever since David had called to tell her the new caregiver would be starting today. From her bedroom window, she watched a woman step out of an older model Honda Civic, straightening her uniform and gathering a small bag from the passenger seat. The woman was tall and moved with quiet confidence, taking her time to look up at the imposing facade of the Whitmore Mansion. Margaret noticed she didn't seem intimidated by the size of the house or the perfectly manicured gardens. Most people paused when they first saw the estate, either impressed by its grandeur or overwhelmed by what it represented. This woman simply nodded to herself as if confirming an address and walked purposefully toward the front door. Margaret rolled her wheelchair away from the window and positioned herself in the sitting room where she usually conducted these first meetings. She had learned over the years that first impressions mattered. If she could establish control early, make it clear that this was her house and her rules, maybe the inevitable disappointment would come sooner rather than later. It was easier that way, less time wasted on false hopes and polite pretenses. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, led the new caregiver into the room a few minutes later. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Amelia Washington. She'll be taking care of you starting today. Margaret looked up from the magazine she had been pretending to read, ready to deliver her usual cold assessment. But something about the woman standing before her made her pause. Amelia Washington was probably in her mid-40s, with kind eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Her uniform was crisp and clean, but Margaret noticed her hands showed signs of hard work, and there was a small scar along her left wrist that spoke of some past injury. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Amelia said, her voice warm but professional. "I'm looking forward to working with you." "Are you?" Margaret replied sharply. "That's what they all say in the beginning. How long do you think you'll last? The record is 4 months, in case you're wondering." Most caregivers would have flinched at that comment, maybe forced a nervous laugh or tried to reassure her that they were different. Amelia simply nodded, as if Margaret had given her useful information rather than a challenge. 4 months is quite a while, Amelia said. That person must have been very patient. What made them leave in the end? The question caught Margaret off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. Usually, they just ignored her warnings or tried to convince her that their relationship would be different. "I threw a book at her," Margaret admitted, not sure why she was being honest. "What kind of book? Does it matter? It might. A paperback romance novel sends a different message than a hardcover encyclopedia." Despite herself, Margaret felt the corner of her mouth twitch. It was a medical textbook about spinal injuries. "Ah," Amelia said, understanding crossing her face. "That wasn't really about her then, was it?" Margaret stared at this woman who had been in her house for less than 5 minutes and was already seeing too much. "I don't know what you mean." "Sometimes we get angry at the message instead of the messenger," Amelia said gently, "especially when the message is something we don't want to hear." There was something in Amelia's tone that suggested she knew about messages people didn't want to hear. Margaret found herself curious despite her better judgment. "The agency said you have experience with difficult patients." "I prefer to think of people as complex rather than difficult," Amelia replied. "We all have reasons for the way we behave. My job is to figure out how to work with those reasons, not against them. And what if my reason is that I simply don't like people anymore? Then I'd ask you why. People usually start out liking other people. Something has to happen to change that." Margaret felt that familiar anger rising in her chest, the defense mechanism that had served her so well for so many years. But there was something about Amelia's calm presence that made it harder to summon her usual fury. This woman wasn't trying to fix her or cheer her up or pretend that everything would be fine if she just had a better attitude. She was simply asking questions, as if Margaret's feelings mattered enough to understand. 20 years, Margaret said finally. 20 years of people looking at me like I'm broken. 20 years of doctors who can't help but keep trying anyway. 20 years of family members who love me but wish I was different. 20 years of watching life happen to everyone else while I sit here getting older and more bitter every day. Amelia listened without interrupting, her face showing genuine attention rather than the polite concern Margaret was used to seeing. When Margaret finished, Amelia was quiet for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. "That sounds exhausting," she said finally. "Being angry for 20 years must take an incredible amount of energy." "It does." The admission surprised Margaret. She had never thought of her anger as tiring before, but now that Amelia mentioned it, she realized how drained she felt most of the time. "I was angry for 2 years, Amelia said, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "After my accident, I couldn't use my left arm properly. Everything I had worked for seemed to disappear overnight. I was a physical therapist, you see. My whole career was based on helping people regain function in their bodies. When I couldn't even brush my own teeth with my dominant hand, it felt like some kind of cosmic joke." Margaret looked more closely at Amelia's left arm, noticing now a slight difference in how she held it. "What happened?" "Car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit me head on. The nerve damage was extensive. The doctor said I might get some function back, but probably not enough to continue my career." Amelia flexed her fingers, and Margaret could see the movement wasn't quite natural. "I was furious. At the drunk driver, at the doctors, at God. at the insurance company, at everyone who still had two working arms. But you got better? Margaret said, not sure if she wanted to hear a success story. I got different, Amelia corrected. I had to learn to do everything in a new way. It took me 2 years to realize that being angry wasn't helping me heal. It was just making me miserable and pushing away everyone who cared about me. So you just decided to stop being angry? Amelia laughed, and the sound was surprisingly genuine. If only it were that simple. No, I had to figure out what I was really angry about. It wasn't the accident, not really. It was the loss of control. The feeling that my life had been decided for me without my permission. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that she wasn't sure she wanted to acknowledge. And then what? Then I had to decide what I could control. I couldn't control what had happened to me, but I could control what I did next. I retrained as a caregiver, learned to use my limitations as strengths. Turns out, having been through trauma myself made me better at understanding what other people were going through. Is that why you took this job? To save another broken person? I took this job because I need the work, Amelia said honestly. My daughter is starting college next year, and physical therapy doesn't pay what it used to. But I stayed after reading your file because I recognized something familiar. What? Someone who's been strong for so long that they don't know how to ask for help anymore. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had spent so many years building her reputation as someone who didn't need anyone, who could handle anything. Life threw at her. Even after the accident, she had refused to show weakness, choosing anger over vulnerability because anger felt safer. I don't know how to ask for help, Margaret admitted quietly. That's okay, Amelia said. I don't know how to give up control without a fight. Maybe we can figure it out together. For the first time in months, Margaret felt something other than dread about the day ahead. This woman wasn't promising miracles or trying to convince her that everything happened for a reason. She was simply offering to stand beside her in the mess of it all, and somehow that felt more valuable than all the false optimism she had endured over the years. I should warn you, Margaret said. I'm not an easy person to like. Good thing. I'm not here to like you, Amelia replied with a smile. I'm here to take care of you. There's a difference. What's the difference? Liking someone is optional. Taking care of someone is a choice you make every day, regardless of how you feel about them in the moment. Margaret considered this as she watched Amelia unpack her bag, arranging medical supplies and personal items with practiced efficiency. There was something comforting about her movements, a sense of competence that didn't feel like showing off. This woman had clearly done this work before, had cared for people who didn't make it easy. Amelia, Margaret said as the morning's first session was about to begin. Yes? Thank you for not telling me everything is going to be fine. Everything might be fine, Amelia said, checking Margaret's blood pressure with gentle hands. But fine looks different for everyone. We'll have to figure out what fine means for you. As the cuff tightened around her arm, Margaret realized that for the first time in 20 years, she was curious about what her version of fine might look like. It was a dangerous feeling, hope. But with Amelia's steady presence beside her, it didn't feel quite so frightening. Maybe this time really would be different. Maybe this time she was ready for it to be. 2 months had passed since Amelia arrived, and the Whitmore mansion felt different. Margaret couldn't put her finger on exactly what had changed, but she noticed small things. The morning sunlight seemed brighter when it streamed through her bedroom windows. The sound of birds outside didn't annoy her as much. Even Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, seemed to smile more often. Margaret was in the bathroom getting ready for her daily routine when she felt Amelia's hands working on her shoulders, during what she called a circulation massage. It had become part of their morning ritual, something Amelia insisted was necessary to prevent muscle stiffness and improve blood flow. Margaret had protested at first, claiming it was unnecessary, but she had grown to appreciate these quiet moments. You're tense today, Amelia observed, her fingers finding knots of stress that Margaret didn't even realize were there. Did you sleep poorly again? I had that dream, Margaret admitted. She had started telling Amelia about her recurring nightmare where she was running through the woods, being chased by something she couldn't see. She always woke up just before whatever was pursuing her caught up. The same one where you're trying to escape? Yes. But this time was different. This time I could feel my legs moving. I could feel the ground under my feet, the wind on my face. It felt so real that when I woke up, I actually tried to get out of bed before I remembered. Amelia's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their gentle work. How did that make you feel? Frustrated, angry, the usual. Margaret hesitated, then added more quietly, but also hopeful, which is worse. Hope hurts more than anger. Why do you think you're having these dreams now after all these years? Margaret had been wondering the same thing. The dreams had started about a month ago, shortly after she and Amelia had begun having their deeper conversations. I don't know. Maybe you're putting ideas in my head. What kind of ideas? That things could be different. That I could be different. Amelia moved her hands down to Margaret's lower back, applying gentle pressure along her spine. As she worked, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a tingling sensation that seemed to spread from where Amelia's fingers touched. Amelia, Margaret said, her voice suddenly tight with surprise. What is it? I felt that. I actually felt your hands on my back. Amelia's hands stilled completely. Where exactly? Right there, where you were pressing. It's faint, but it's definitely there. Margaret's heart began to race. For 20 years, she had felt nothing below her waist except phantom pain that the doctor said was normal. This was different. This was real sensation. Don't move, Amelia said quietly. She applied pressure again, this time more deliberately. How about now? Yes, I can feel it. Oh my God, Amelia, I can actually feel it. Amelia helped Margaret back into her wheelchair, but her expression was serious rather than excited. Margaret, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Have you had any other sensations recently? Anything at all? Even if it seemed like your imagination? Margaret thought back over the past few weeks. Sometimes, when you helped me transfer from my chair to the bed, I thought I felt something in my left leg. But I assumed it was just wishful thinking. What about tingling? Any feelings like pins and needles? A few times, but the doctor said that was normal. Phantom sensations, they called them. Amelia was quiet for a long moment, her medical training clearly taking over. Margaret, I want you to know that what you're feeling might not mean what you hope it means. Sometimes nerve sensations can return without indicating any real improvement in function. But it could mean something, couldn't it? It could. But I think we need to have you seen by a specialist. Someone who can run proper tests and give us real answers. Margaret felt that familiar fear creeping in, the same terror she had experienced countless times when doctors had raised and then crushed her hopes. What if they say it's nothing? What if I'm just imagining things because I want so badly for something to change? Then we'll deal with that together, Amelia said firmly. But what if they say it's something? What if 20 years of assuming the worst has prevented you from discovering something important? That afternoon, Amelia made phone calls while Margaret sat on her terrace, staring at the gardens without really seeing them. The possibility that her condition might not be as permanent as everyone believed was almost too terrifying to consider. She had built her entire identity around being the woman who couldn't walk, the victim of a tragic accident who had learned to be strong in her limitations. David arrived that evening, having driven over as soon as Amelia called him. Margaret watched from her wheelchair as he paced the living room, his excitement barely contained. Mom, this could be incredible news. Dr. Richardson is one of the best spinal specialists in the country. If anyone can figure out what's happening, it's him. Don't get your hopes up, Margaret warned, though she could hear the hope creeping into her own voice despite her best efforts. I've been disappointed by doctors before. This is different, David insisted. You're actually feeling sensation. That has to mean something. Patricia arrived an hour later with her husband and teenage daughter. The whole family gathered in the living room while Amelia explained what had happened and what the next steps would be. Margaret felt overwhelmed by their enthusiasm, their immediate assumption that this was the beginning of a miracle. What if it's not what we hope, Margaret asked finally. What if the tests show that these sensations don't mean anything significant? Then, nothing changes, Amelia said simply. You'll still be the same person you were this morning, but we won't know unless we try. Dr. Richardson's office was everything Margaret remembered about medical facilities: sterile, efficient, and filled with cautious optimism that felt dangerous to trust. The doctor himself was younger than she had expected, with kind eyes behind, wire-rimmed glasses, and a manner that was both professional and genuinely caring. The tests were extensive: MRIs, nerve conduction studies, reflex examinations that brought back memories of her earliest days after the accident. Through it all, Amelia stayed beside her, offering quiet support and asking the technical questions that Margaret was too nervous to voice. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Richardson said finally, pulling up images on his computer screen, I want to show you something interesting. The MRI images looked like abstract art to Margaret, black and white swirls that supposedly revealed the secrets of her spine. But Dr. Richardson pointed to specific areas with the enthusiasm of someone who had found something unexpected. Here's your original injury site, he said, indicating an area that looked different from the surrounding tissue. The damage is significant, as we expected, but look at this area here, and here. He pointed to other spots on the image. Over the years, scar tissue has formed around your spinal cord. Some of that tissue appears to be putting pressure on nerve pathways that weren't originally damaged. What does that mean? Margaret asked, afraid to hope. It means that some of your paralysis might not be from the original injury. It might be from compression that has developed over time. And compression, unlike severed nerves, can sometimes be addressed surgically. The room seemed to spin around Margaret. Are you saying I might be able to walk again? I'm saying there's a possibility that we could restore some function. I can't promise you'll walk normally, or even walk at all. But the sensations you're experiencing suggest that some of your nerve pathways are still intact. If we can relieve the pressure on them, you might regain partial sensation and possibly some movement. Amelia squeezed Margaret's hand, and for the first time in years, Margaret squeezed back without thinking about it. Then she realized what she had done, staring down at their joined hands in amazement. I just squeezed your hand, she whispered. I know, Amelia said, tears forming in her eyes. I felt it. Dr. Richardson smiled. That's a very good sign. It suggests that the pathways between your brain and your extremities are more intact than your original diagnosis indicated. The drive home was quiet, both women lost in their own thoughts. Margaret stared out the window at the familiar roads, seeing them differently now. Everything looked the same, but the possibility that her future might be different from her past made the whole world seem changed. Are you scared? Amelia asked as they pulled into the circular driveway of the mansion. Terrified, Margaret admitted. For 20 years, I've known exactly what to expect from each day. I've made peace with my limitations. Now you're telling me that maybe those limitations weren't as fixed as I thought. Change is scary, even when it's good change. What if the surgery doesn't work? What if I go through all of this and nothing improves? Then you'll know you tried everything possible, and you won't spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. That night, Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. The sensations in her legs had grown stronger throughout the day, as if her body was waking up from a long sleep. She tried moving her toes and thought she felt the slightest response. For the first time in 20 years, Margaret Whitmore fell asleep, believing that tomorrow might be different from today. It was the most frightening and wonderful feeling she had experienced since her accident, and she owed it all to the woman sleeping in the guest room down the hall, the woman who had refused to accept that hope was a luxury Margaret couldn't afford. The surgery was scheduled for the following month, but Margaret already felt like her real recovery had begun the day Amelia walked into her life and refused to treat her like a lost cause. The morning of the surgery arrived gray and rainy, as if the weather understood the weight of what was about to happen. Margaret had barely slept, spending most of the night alternating between excitement and terror. At 65 years old, she was about to undergo a procedure that could either give her back something she had mourned for 20 years or confirm once and for all that her dreams of walking were just that, dreams. Amelia had stayed overnight in the guest room, knowing that Margaret would need support getting ready for the early morning departure to the hospital. She found Margaret already awake at 5 in the morning, sitting by her bedroom window and watching the rain streak down the glass. "Second thoughts?" Amelia asked gently, settling into the chair beside Margaret's wheelchair. "Third and fourth thoughts," Margaret admitted. "I keep thinking about what Dr. Richardson said. Even if the surgery is successful, there's no guarantee I'll walk normally. I might only regain partial sensation. I might be able to stand but not walk. I might get my hopes up for nothing. Or you might surprise everyone, including yourself." Margaret turned to look at Amelia, this woman who had become so much more than a caregiver over the past 4 months. "You really believe this will work, don't you?" "I believe you're stronger than you think you are. And I believe that 20 years of assuming the worst doesn't mean you can't hope for something better now." The hospital was bustling with early morning activity when they arrived. David and Patricia were already waiting in the family lounge, looking nervous but trying to project confidence for their mother's sake. Margaret's granddaughter, Claire, had driven down from college to be there, her young face serious with the weight of the occasion. "Grandma, you're going to do great," Claire said, hugging Margaret carefully. "I've been telling everyone at school about your surgery. My roommate says her aunt had spinal surgery and now she runs marathons." "Let's start with walking to the mailbox," Margaret said with a smile, though her granddaughter's faith meant more to her than she could express. Dr. Richardson appeared in his surgical scrubs, looking calm and prepared. He sat down across from Margaret, making sure she could see his face clearly when he spoke. "Are you ready for this, Mrs. Whitmore?" "As ready as I'll ever be. Tell me again what you're going to do." "We're going to remove the scar tissue that's putting pressure on your spinal cord. It's delicate work, but the imaging shows us exactly where we need to focus. The procedure should take about 4 hours. When you wake up, we'll do some basic tests to see if there's any immediate change in sensation. And if there isn't, then we wait. Sometimes it takes weeks or even months for the nerves to respond once the pressure is relieved. Recovery isn't always immediate." Margaret nodded, trying to absorb this information one more time. The unknown stretched ahead of her like a vast ocean, and she was about to dive into water she couldn't see the bottom of. When the time came to go into surgery, Amelia walked alongside Margaret's gurney as far as the operating room doors would allow. "I'll be right here when you wake up," she promised, squeezing Margaret's hand. "What if I can't do this, Amelia? What if the recovery is too hard? Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time. That's what we've been doing all along, isn't it?" The surgery seemed to last forever for those waiting in the family lounge. David paced continuously, while Patricia tried to work on her laptop, but kept staring at the same email without reading it. Claire dozed fitfully in one of the uncomfortable chairs. Amelia sat quietly, occasionally updating the family on what was likely happening at each stage of the procedure based on her medical knowledge. Finally, Dr. Richardson appeared in the doorway, still in his surgical clothes but with a smile on, his face that made everyone sit up straighter. "The surgery went very well," he announced. "We were able to remove all the scar tissue that was compressing the nerve pathways. Mrs. Whitmore is in recovery now, and she's asking for Amelia." Margaret was groggy from the anesthesia, but alert enough to recognize Amelia's face when she leaned over the hospital bed. "How do you feel?" Amelia asked. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Margaret mumbled, then her eyes widened. "But I can feel your hand holding mine. I can really feel it." Dr. Richardson conducted a series of tests right there in the recovery room. He touched Margaret's legs with a small instrument, asking her to tell him when she felt pressure. To everyone's amazement, Margaret could feel sensation in areas that had been completely numb for 20 years. "This is very encouraging," Dr. Richardson said. "But remember, sensation and movement are different things. We'll need to see how much motor function returns as the swelling from surgery goes down." The next few weeks were a mix of small victories and frustrating setbacks. Some days, Margaret could move her toes just slightly. Other days, the effort to try seemed overwhelming. Physical therapy sessions were painful and exhausting, requiring her to relearn movements that healthy people took for granted. Amelia was there for every session, every small triumph, and every moment of despair. When Margaret wanted to give up, Amelia reminded her how far she had already come. When Margaret pushed too hard and exhausted herself, Amelia helped her rest without feeling guilty about it. "I don't understand why this is so difficult," Margaret said one afternoon after a particularly challenging therapy session. I thought if the surgery worked, everything would just go back to normal. Your body is remembering how to do things it hasn't done in 20 years, Amelia explained. It's like learning a foreign language you spoke as a child. The knowledge is there, but it takes practice to make it fluent again. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after surgery. Margaret was working with her physical therapist, practicing transferring her weight from her wheelchair to a standing frame, when something clicked. Instead of needing the full support of the frame, she found herself actually bearing weight on her legs. Amelia, she called out, her voice filled with excitement and disbelief. Look! Amelia rushed over to see Margaret standing, really standing, with just light support from the parallel bars. Her legs were shaky and weak, but they were holding her up. How does it feel? Amelia asked, tears streaming down her face. Terrifying. And wonderful, Margaret laughed, crying at the same time. I'm standing up. After 20 years, I'm actually standing up. The progress accelerated after that day. Margaret's determination, combined with intensive physical therapy and Amelia's constant encouragement, led to more and more mobility. First, she could stand for several minutes. Then she could take a few shuffling steps between the parallel bars. Then she could walk short distances with a walker. 8 months after her surgery, Margaret received an invitation that changed everything. Her granddaughter Claire was getting married, and she wanted Margaret to walk her down the aisle since her grandfather wasn't alive to do it. I don't know if I'm ready for something that public, Margaret worried. What if I fall? What if my legs give out in front of everyone? Then we'll help you up and keep going, David said. Claire specifically asked for you, Mom. She says you're the strongest person she knows, and she wants you beside her on the most important day of her life. The wedding was held in the garden of the Whitmore estate, transformed with white flowers and flowing fabric that moved gently in the spring breeze. Margaret had practiced the walk down the makeshift aisle dozens of times with Amelia's help, but her heart was still pounding as the music began. Claire looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly. She took Margaret's arm, and together they began the slow, careful walk down the petal-strewn path. Margaret's legs were shaky, and she had to concentrate on every step, but she was walking. Really walking. The assembled guests rose to their feet, many of them wiping away tears as they witnessed what many had thought impossible. Halfway down the aisle, Margaret looked over at Amelia, who was sitting in the front row with David and Patricia. The woman who had refused to accept that Margaret's story was over, who had pushed her to hope again when hope seemed foolish, was crying openly as she watched her patient and friend achieve the impossible. After the ceremony, as the reception continued around them, Margaret and Amelia sat together on the terrace where they had shared so many conversations over the past year and a half. I have something to tell you, Margaret said, her voice serious. Amelia looked concerned. What is it? I've been thinking about what I want to do with the rest of my life. For 20 years, I just existed. I survived each day without really living. But now I have a second chance, and I don't want to waste it. What are you thinking? I want to start a foundation for spinal cord research, but also for support services for people dealing with long-term disabilities. I want to help people who are where I was, people who have given up hope. That sounds wonderful, Margaret. I want you to run it with me. I know you need to think about your daughter's future, about your own career, but I can't imagine doing this without you. Amelia was quiet for a long moment, watching the wedding guests dance on the lawn below them. Are you offering me a job, Mrs. Whitmore? I'm offering you a partnership, Margaret said, and I think it's time you started calling me Margaret. As the sun set over the estate, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, two women who had saved each other sat together, planning a future neither of them had imagined possible. Margaret's legs still ached from the walk down the aisle, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from using muscles that were remembering how to be strong. The impossible had become possible, not through magic or miracles, but through the simple, powerful combination of hope, determination, and two people who refused to give up on each other. And this, Margaret realized, was just the beginning.